The first part he gave away was a hydraulic cylinder. It was a Thursday morning in April of 2004, and a farmer named Leonard Voss had pulled his truck into Ray Holman's driveway outside Perrysville, Indiana, with a look on his face that Ray recognized immediately. The look of a man who has something broken during planting week and has already calculated what it is going to cost him and has not arrived at a number he can afford. Leonard was 58 years old. He farmed 320 acres in Vermilion County and had been doing it alone since his wife passed in 2001. He ran a Massey Ferguson 390 as his primary tractor and a 265 as his secondary, both of them older, both of them maintained with the specific care of a man who cannot afford to replace what he cannot afford to fix. The 390's hydraulic cylinder had cracked at the base, a hairline fracture that had propagated under the pressure of spring tillage until it failed completely during his first pass through his east field that morning. The field work was stopped. The planting window was moving forward without him. He had called 3 dealers. None of them had the cylinder in stock. The nearest one that did was 90 miles away and couldn't get it delivered before Monday. Leonard had come to Ray's because Ray was known, in the loose network of knowledge that circulates through farming communities without ever being formally organized, as a man who kept parts. Not as a business, not for sale, exactly. Just as a man who had accumulated across 20 years of buying broken machines and stripping usable components from them, a shelf inventory that covered a surprising range of Massey Ferguson equipment from the 1970s through the early 1990s. Ray was 51 years old. He farmed 440 acres and maintained his equipment from a shed that had grown in the way that things grow when a person has a specific kind of knowledge and applies it without particular plan, from a single bay with a parts shelf into a 3-bay operation with 2 full walls of organized inventory. He had not set out to build a parts inventory. He had set out to keep his own machines running at a cost that his operation could support. And keeping his own machines running had required sourcing parts that weren't available through normal channels. And sourcing parts that weren't available through normal channels had led him to buy broken machines at auction for the components they contained. And buying broken machines for components had eventually produced, without anyone designing it, a wall of shelves with parts that covered more equipment than just his own. He took Leonard to the shed. He found the hydraulic cylinder in 12 minutes. It was from a 265 he had stripped in 2001, and the 265 and the 390 shared the same cylinder in that position, which Leonard had not known and Ray had known because Ray had read the parts catalog the way some people read novels, completely and with attention to detail. Leonard asked what it would cost him. Ray said nothing. Take it and get your field done. Leonard said, Ray, I can't take that for nothing. Ray said, it's been on that shelf for 3 years. It's not doing anyone any good there. Take it. Leonard took it. He had his field done by that evening. He came back the following week with a case of beer and set it on Ray's workbench. Ray said he didn't need to do that. Leonard said he knew he didn't need to, and that he had done it anyway. They drank 1 beer each standing in the shed, and Leonard drove home. Ray put the case in the corner of the shed and went back to the hydraulic pump he'd been rebuilding when Leonard had pulled in. He did not write anything down. He did not keep a list. He did not think of what he'd done as the beginning of anything. He had given a neighbor a part that was sitting unused on a shelf because the neighbor needed it and the shelf didn't. That was the entirety of it. But Leonard Voss told people. That was how Leonard was. Not a gossip, not a man who talked excessively, but a man who told the truth about what happened to him. And what happened to him that Thursday in April of 2004 was that a neighbor had given him a hydraulic cylinder that saved his planting week. And that was the truth, and it was worth telling. Ray Holman had grown up farming alongside a father who maintained his own equipment because the dealership was far and the money was short and the machines needed to run regardless of either condition. His father Clarence had run Massey Ferguson equipment since 1958, not from brand loyalty in the emotional sense, but from the practical loyalty of a man who has learned a brand's mechanical character deeply enough that switching means starting the learning over, and starting over is a cost that only makes sense when the alternative is worse. By the time Ray took over the farm in 1989, after Clarence's retirement at 72, he understood Massey Ferguson equipment at a depth that most dealer mechanics didn't reach. He understood not just what the service manual said, but what the machines did when what the service manual said and what the machine was doing were two different things. The specific knowledge that only accumulates through years of working the same equipment in the same conditions while paying close attention. He had started buying broken machines at auction in 1994, not for resale, not as a business, but because a Massey Ferguson 265 with a cracked block had appeared at a farm sale in Warren County for $600, and Ray had calculated that the hydraulic system, the transmission, and the three-point linkage were collectively worth more than $600 to him personally. He was right. The 265 yielded components he used over the following 4 years. He established a rhythm, 1 or 2 machines per year, stripped methodically, cataloged in the notebook on the workbench, stored on shelves in a system only he could fully navigate. The inventory was specific, not comprehensive. The models his neighbors ran, the failure points those models showed, the components those failures required, built by watching what broke in his county across 20 years of farming and paying attention to what came next. Leonard Voss's hydraulic cylinder was the first component he gave away without charge. It would not be the last. The second was a fuel injector, given to Dale Atchison in August of 2004. Dale's Massey Ferguson 3060 had been losing power under load, enough to slow his combining and cost him time in a harvest window already compressed by weather. Ray had the injector on the shelf. He gave it to Dale with the service manual installation instructions photocopied on his kitchen copier. The third was a set of front axle bearings for Warren Spratt in the spring of 2005. The 4th through 7th came in 2006, a PTO shaft coupling, a hydraulic pump seal kit, a pair of lift arm pins, and a set of filter elements covering 3 different models, each given to a different farmer, each given without charge. By the end of 2007, Ray had given away 14 components to 11 different farmers across Vermilion and Fountain counties. He had not charged for any of them. He had not kept a transaction log. The notebook was a parts inventory, not a ledger. He knew approximately what he had given and to whom, the way a person knows the shape of 7 years without citing each specific date. He had not calculated what it cost him. The parts had cost money when he bought the machines they came from. The time to strip and catalog them had cost time. Neither had been recovered. Ray had not thought about this in terms of cost and recovery. The parts were for keeping the machines in his county running. The mechanism by which they got from his shelf to the machine that needed them was less important than the result. His wife Sandra understood this. She kept the household accounts and was aware of the pattern. She raised it once in 2006, not as a complaint, but as a question. "Are you going to keep doing this?" Ray said, "Doing what?" Sandra said, "You know what?" Ray said, "Yes." "Okay then." That was the entirety of the conversation, because Sandra asked questions to understand situations, not to change them. The fire started on a Wednesday night in March of 2011. Ray did not know the cause, not that night, and not definitively afterward. The county fire report cited an electrical fault in the old wiring at the north end of the barn, wiring that had been there since Clarence's time, that Ray had intended to update and had deferred across the previous 3 winters for reasons that felt adequate at the time and felt less adequate in the days following the fire. The barn had been built in 1954. The wiring was original. The combination of old wire and a dry March had produced, sometime after midnight on a Wednesday, a fire that had taken the barn completely before the trucks from Perrysville arrived. Ray had been woken by Sandra at 2 in the morning. He had called 911 and then stood in the driveway in the cold March air and watched the barn go. There was nothing to do. The fire was too far along before anyone woke to fight it. He stood and watched the structure his father had built in 1954 burn down to its foundation, and felt the specific numbness that comes when a loss is large enough that the mind cannot immediately process its full dimensions. He barn had contained, his grain storage, 4,000 bushels of corn he had been holding for a better price, his tillage equipment, a chisel plow, a field cultivator, a disc, his parts inventory, 7 years of shelves built from stripped machines, organized in the system that only he fully understood, his Massey Ferguson 2680, which had been parked in the barn's north bay the previous evening because he had been changing its oil when darkness came and had left it inside rather than move it back to the equipment shed. And the notebook on the workbench, the parts inventory, the records, the system. All of it was gone by 4 in the morning. The foundation was still smoking when the last truck left at 6. Ray stood at the edge of what had been the barn and looked at the ash and the twisted metal of the shelf supports and the concrete foundation that had survived what the structure above it had not. He did not speak for a long time. Sandra stood beside him. She did not speak either. There was nothing to say that the situation didn't already contain. He went inside at 7, drank coffee, and began the mental process of calculating what was gone and what it would take to replace it, and what the sequence of replacement would need to be to get the farm back to full operation before planting. The calculation was not encouraging. The grain loss alone was significant. 4,000 bushels at current prices was money he had been counting toward the spring input bill. The equipment was insured, but insurance settlements take time, and spring planting does not. The parts inventory had no insurance value. Ray had never listed it as an insurable asset because it had never been a formal business. And the 2680 was covered, but not at replacement cost, which meant the insurance check would not produce an equivalent machine. He was still doing the calculation on Thursday morning when his phone rang for the first time. It was Leonard Voss. Leonard said he'd heard about the fire from Dale Atchison, who had heard about it from Warren Spratt, who had driven past on his way to the elevator at 6 in the morning and seen the foundation. Leonard said he was sorry. Then he said he was coming over on Saturday and asked if Ray needed him to bring anything specific. Ray said he didn't know yet what he needed. He was still figuring out the scope. Leonard said, "I'll come anyway. Call me if you think of something before Saturday." Dale Atchison called an hour later. He said the same thing. Approximately, he'd heard he was sorry he was coming Saturday. Warren Spratt called that afternoon. Then a farmer named Ed Cummins called. Then Harold Fink. Then 2 brothers, Carl and Dennis Albrecht, who farmed adjacent ground 4 miles north and who Ray had given a set of lift arm pins to in 2006, 1 pin each, because that had been what the shelf had, and the job had needed 2, and Ray had split what he had between the 2 machines. By Friday evening, Ray had received 11 phone calls. Every one of them ended the same way. "I'm coming Saturday. What do you need?" On Saturday morning at 7:30, 14 trucks pulled into Ray Holman's driveway. Ray was in the driveway when the first truck arrived. He had not expected 14. He had expected perhaps 4 or 5. The neighbors who had called, showing up because they had said they would. Instead, the driveway filled with trucks and trailers, some of them carrying lumber, some of them carrying tools, some of them carrying equipment that the owners had loaded without being asked, because they had looked at what a barn rebuild required and loaded what they thought the job would need. Leonard Voss brought 200 feet of electrical wire and a licensed electrician. His nephew, who had driven from Terre Haute at Leonard's request, arriving at 6 in the morning to be sure he was there when the work started. Dale Atchison brought a concrete saw and a trailer load of dimensional lumber, sourced from a mill in Fountain County where Dale had called in a debt of his own that morning. Warren Spratt brought his tractor and a post-hole digger attachment and said he'd start on the foundation work if someone told him where the corners were going. The other 11 brought what 11 farmers bring when they show up for a neighbor who needs rebuilding: tools, materials, time, the specific practical knowledge of people who have built and repaired things across a working lifetime, and who understand, without needing it explained, what a barn rebuild requires and in what order it requires it. Ray stood in the driveway and looked at 14 trucks and 14 men who had come because 7 years of giving parts away without keeping score had accumulated into a debt that the community was now settling in the only currency that mattered, which was presence and work and the willingness to be there on a cold Saturday morning because someone needed them to be. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I don't know how to thank you all." Leonard said, "You already did, 7 years ago, mostly." Dale Atkinson said, "Where do you want us to start?" Ray said, "Warren's doing the foundation corners. If someone can get lumber sorted by dimension, we can start framing by noon." They started framing before noon. The barn took 11 days to rebuild. Not the full barn, a structure equivalent in footprint and function to what had burned, with new wiring run by Leonard's nephew to a standard that the 1954 original had never met. The farmers who came on the first Saturday came back on subsequent days as their own schedules allowed. Some came every day. Some came when they could. The work was continuous because someone was always there, and the someone was always one of the 14 who had shown up on the first morning. Ray worked alongside them. He did not stand back and direct. He framed and lifted and ran wire and poured concrete and did every job that was available to be done alongside the men who had come to do it. Sandra brought food at noon every day. Enough for whoever was there, which was sometimes 6 people and sometimes 12, and she made enough for 12 either way, because that was the right approach when you didn't know the number in advance. On the 11th day, the barn was closed in, the roof was on, the wiring was done and inspected. The concrete floor of the North Bay, poured in the first week, had cured. The shelving along the east wall was new lumber, installed by Carl and Dennis Albrecht on a Thursday afternoon, and it was better shelving than what had burned, because Carl had a table saw and the skill to use it, and had cut the shelf boards to a standard the old barn had never had. Ray stood in the new barn on the evening of the 11th day, after the last truck had left. The building smelled of new wood and fresh concrete. The shelves were empty. The parts inventory was gone and would take years to rebuild, if it was rebuilt at all. The equipment bays were empty except for his field cultivator, which had been stored in the equipment shed and had survived the fire without damage. He stood in the empty building and looked at the new shelving along the east wall and thought about 7 years of giving parts away without keeping score, and about 14 trucks in his driveway on a Saturday morning, and about 11 days of men who came because they had been the ones to whom something had been given and understood, without anyone saying it. That this was the moment when the other side of that transaction arrived. The Massey Ferguson 2680 had been destroyed in the fire. The insurance settlement came in at $6,200. Ray used it to buy a used Massey Ferguson 30,090 at a farm sale in Warren County the following spring, a clean machine with 7,000 hours on it at a price that left him $1,200 for parts. The 3090 went into the north bay of the new barn, and Ray began, slowly and without urgency, to rebuild the shelf inventory from machines that came available at prices that made sense. The first part he put on the new shelves was a hydraulic cylinder from a Massey Ferguson 390. He set it in the same position it would have occupied on the old shelves, front wall, third shelf from the top, left section. He labeled it in the same system he had used before, in the new notebook he had started after the fire. He looked at it on the shelf for a moment. Then he went back to work. Ray Holman still farms 440 acres in Vermilion County. He is 69 years old. The barn the 14 men built in 11 days in March of 2011 is still standing. The wiring Leonard's nephew installed has never given him a problem. The shelves Carl and Dennis Albrecht built are better than the ones they replaced, and Ray thinks about that sometimes when he is pulling a component from them. The parts inventory on those shelves is smaller than what burned. Ray has not tried to rebuild it to its previous scale. He is farming alone now, Sandra having passed in 2016, and the time that rebuilding the inventory would require is time he puts toward the farm itself. But the shelf holds what the machines in his county are most likely to need, the knowledge of which has not changed because the machines have not changed, and the failure modes have not changed, and Ray's 20 years of watching both has not changed either. Leonard Voss retired in 2018. His son farms the 320 acres now and has come to Ray's shed twice. Once for a filter he needed on short notice, once with a question about a hydraulic noise on his 390 that Ray diagnosed in 4 minutes. Ray did not charge for either. Leonard's son thanked him and said his father had told him about the hydraulic cylinder in 2004. Ray said he remembered. Leonard's son said, "Dad said you saved his planting season." Ray said the cylinder saved his planting season. "I just had it on the shelf." Leonard's son said he understood the distinction and that his father had said essentially the same thing and that neither of them entirely believed it. Ray did not argue. He sent the young man home with the filter and the diagnosis and went back to the machine he had been working on. Outside, the April fields were ready. The Massey Ferguson 3090 was in the lot, greased and fueled for the season. The barn that 14 men built in 11 days was behind it. Solid, its new wood weathered now to the color of something that has been standing for a long time. It had been standing for 14 years. It would stand for a long time yet. The parts on the shelves inside were for the machines in the county. The barn was for the parts. And the 14 farmers who had built it in 11 days. That had been for Ray, though Ray would have said it was simply what neighbors did when a neighbor needed them. In Vermilion County, in the farming communities that Ray Holman had spent his life working among, that was not a remarkable statement. It was just a description of how things were supposed to work. Most of the time, that was exactly how they worked.